Welcome to the third panel, the second session dealing with Peri-Saharan Africa. We have two talks during this panel. Every speaker will have 30 minutes. I'll sit here, and after 25 minutes, I'll give you a wave. And our first speaker is Professor Sarah Stroumsa, who's one of the organizers of this workshop. And she's the Alice and Jack Ormond Professor Emerita of Arabic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she served as Vice Rector 2003-2006 and as Rector from 2008 to 2012 at the university. She's currently President of the Society for the Study of Medieval Judeo-Arabic Culture, and she's a member of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, and an associate member of the Academy of the Kingdom of Jordan. Among Morocco. Oh dear. Maybe that's a sign of things to come, let's hope. Among her many publications, I'll just mention several of her books. Maimonides in His World, Portrait of a Medieval Thinker, Princeton 2009. Free Thinkers of Medieval Islam, Ibn Rawandi, Abu Bakr ibn al-Razi and the Impact on Islamic Thought, Brill 1999. Al-Andalus and Safarad on Philosophy and Its History and Islamic Spain, Princeton 2019, and I'm sure there are other things in the works. The topic Sarah will be talking about today is a cultural tell in search of vestiges of medieval Jewish Berber cultural contacts. Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank everybody present here because since yesterday afternoon, I feel like I'm in a master's class, and in a very special master class where there's a single student and many masters, and I really feel that I learn a lot, and I thank you very much for being here and for sharing your knowledge. I am a novice into Africa, and I'll try to present a question today. So, the presence of Jews in late antique West Africa or in early medieval sub-Saharan Africa is wrapped in mythical haze. Although the stories are persistent, for the historian much in them remains unverifiable. At the other end, in terms of documentation, stand the Arabic-speaking Jews of medieval North Africa from Egypt to Morocco. Their life are recorded in a plethora of Geniza manuscripts, as well as in literary Jewish and Muslim sources. The present lecture discusses a third group, whose presence and the marks it left on history cannot be relegated to the realm of myth, yet it left next to no written record. For convenience sake, I will call this group the medieval Berberized Jews, although some of the same people may turn up in Geniza documents also as Arabicized Jews. Let me begin by introducing our main actors, North African Ibadis and North African Jews. The Kharijite subsect of the Ibadiyya is said to have begun in Basra when Abdallah ibn Ibad al-Tamimi broke away from the Kharijite extremists over the question of the proper attitude towards other Muslims. The Kharijite rebellion, roughly coinciding with the fall of the Umayyads, hastened North African administrative and spiritual autonomy, marked by the preponderance of the Berber ethnic element. In 745, Abd al-Rahman ibn Rustum established an Ibadi imamate in Tripolitania, and in 777 he was proclaimed imam. Tahat remained the capital of the Ibadi Rustamids until its destruction by the Fatimids in 909. Thereafter, they found refuge in remote or rural areas, the Algerian Mezab, Wargla, Fezan, the island of Jerba, and Jabal Nafusa. As already Tadeusz Lewicki has shown, I quote, the west-northern African trade routes to Bilad Sudan existed largely thanks to the work of the North African Ibadites, end of quote. Tahert became a major stop on the sub-Saharan trade routes. Ibadi trading networks that tapped into Bilad Sudan were established as early as the end of the 7th century, and in the 8th and 9th centuries, they gained monopoly over the slave trade. From the 8th century, the Ibadi traders extended their trade southward. Between 750 and 950, the Ibadis controlled the trade routes in the Maghrib and in the Bilad Sudan, up to Gao and Ghana. Ibadi merchants held most of the northwestern trade routes, leading from the Mediterranean coast across the Sahara. And they continued to play a crucial role until at least the 13th century. The difficulties of the long and dangerous journey across the Sahara, however, demanded a complex strategy involving more participants than those of a simple binary sender-recipient structure. We thus witnessed the development of a relay system which brought Jews into close cooperation with the Ibadi Berbers. The arduous crossing of the desert remained in the hands of Berber, mostly Ibadi or Sufri merchants. In the hubs on the Sahara's northern edge, however, the merchandise changed hands and was transferred to the specialists of connections with the Mediterranean littoral, mostly Jews. Sijil Massa, on the way from Kairawan to Oudagost and Ghana, became a hub for the network of Jewish merchants with tight business and family connections to Cairo and the Levant. A similar hub emerged in Ouarglan on the way to Tademeka and Gao with the local Karaite community, perhaps the only significant Karaite community in North Africa west of Egypt. Jews from Sijil Massa did not normally cross the desert. Their role was to take the goods that arrived with the Berbers from sub-Saharan Africa and bring them to Tahert or Kairawan. Or it was also to bring them from Tahert to Sijil Massa and hand them over to the Berbers who would cross the Sahara. These Berbers were mostly Khawarij, Ibadis in Tahert or Sufrits in Sijil Massa. A similar bi-communal network functioned also in the Fezzan. These tight business connections created what Nehemiah Lev Zion described as, I quote, a complementary Khariji Jewish trade system, end of quote. And what Pesach Shinar, discussing contemporary Jewish communities, called a Judeo-Ibadit symbiosis. As is well known, the term symbiosis was coined by Shlomo Dov Goitein to describe the interlocked life of the Jewish community with the dominant Muslim society. Across the medieval Islamicate world, the Judeo-Arabic symbiosis found its expression in the thorough Arabization of the Jewish society, the adoption of Judeo-Arabic in Hebrew characters, as well as the cultivation of Arabic literary models, and of course, in social practices. It is also evident in the thorough integration of Jews in the intellectual world of the times, where the influence of Islamic theology and philosophy shaped Jewish medieval philosophical thought. Given the tight connections between Jews and Berbers, one could expect to see similar linguistic and cultural manifestations of the Judeo-Ibadit symbiosis. At the present state of research, however, such expectation could be brutally dashed. It is not merely that we find less evidence of Berber cultural impact than of Arab influence. In Muslim texts in general, the appearance of Jews is anecdotal, and the Ibadi texts are no exception to this rule. And from the Jewish medieval sources, it would be hard to guess even the very existence of such a tight Berber Jewish network. In Goitein's voluminous Mediterranean society, Berbers are mentioned only fleetingly as recruits to the Fatimid armies or in order to set the scene for European medieval merchants. If the Jewish-Berber connection is granted a few lines, it is only to explain family names like those of Ibn Yiju and Luchtush or the name Dunash. With a handful of minor exceptions, it would be fair to say that in the Jewish medieval documents and in the contemporary research on these documents, the Berbers and their connection to the Jewish communities do not exist. The remaining part of my paper is therefore dedicated to ponder this puzzling absence. I will examine three aspects where we could have expected to see the marks of Berber culture: language, business practices, and theology. I will first attempt to justify the expectation, then describe the absence and offer an explanation for it, and finally give an example of the impact that can nevertheless be detected. So first, language. The tight trading relay system described above inevitably implies verbal exchanges, which obviously necessitate a common language. The starting point of current research, aptly formulated by Ercilia Francesca, is that, I quote, "The long-distance overland network often used Arabic as a common language, Islam as a common religion, and the Sharia as a common legal system," end of quote. Indeed, the standard written language across the Islamic empire was Arabic, but the Arabization in North Africa advanced slowly. There are many indications that even as late as the 12th century, large parts of the indigenous Berber population did not speak Arabic, let alone read it. And the spoken language across vast areas was mostly Berber, or more precisely, one of the Berber languages. Furthermore, although Berber languages as such were not written, there is sufficient evidence for the infiltration into the written sphere. The Almohad Mahdi ibn Tumart, who died in 1130, for example, not only preached in his own Berber language, but also wrote it, probably in Arabic script, then translating it to Arabic. The Berber language was also used by Ibadi scholars in religious discussions, and there is evidence for the existence of Berber Ibadi books written in transliteration. The influence of the spoken Berber language is attested also in medieval documents, where it left its marks in the written correspondence. That these Berber languages were also used by North African Jews must follow necessarily from their tight business connections with Ibadi Berbers. It is also attested by a glossary of Berber words included in the Risala of Judah ibn Quraysh, a native of Tahert, who moved probably following the conquest of this city by the Fatimids in 909 to Fez. As far as I know, however, this is so far the only literary evidence, and perhaps even the only written evidence, for the use of Berber by Jews in this period. The lack of evidence for Jewish use of Berber languages is all the more surprising if we remember that the overwhelming majority of business correspondence preserved in the Cairo Geniza and dating until the 11th century is authored by people originally from Tunisia and some from Sicily. Considering the deep involvement of Tunisian Jewish merchants with Berbers in general and with Ibadis in particular, one would have expected this involvement to have left at least some marks in their correspondence. The common practice of Jews to transcribe the local spoken language, as well as their own dialect of it, in Hebrew characters, makes the absence of written Berber in the Geniza still more bewildering. If Jews spoke Berber, why didn't they write to each other in Judeo-Berber? as they wrote in Judeo-Arabic or in other Jewish languages? The answer to this question lies probably in the different status of Arabic and Berber, as well as in the social structure of the Jewish medieval community. Arabic was the language of the high culture, in which not only Muslim Arabs, but also people of different ethnic and religious identities participated. It also became, along with Hebrew, the language of communication between communities across the Jewish diaspora, as well as between different sections of the global trading network. Therefore, even Jewish merchants who used Berber in their local setting communicated with their business partners in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. This being the case, one could still expect to find an occasional Berber word or reference to the Berber connection in the Geniza documents. But we won't find them if we don't look for them. And in order to look for them, we have to change our presuppositions. For example, the presupposition that when the term Khawarij appears in Geniza document, it may mean dissenters or usurpers or Almohads or perhaps even the literal cities, anything but Khawarij. And we also have to include the knowledge of Berber languages and their use as a significant feature of North African Jewish life in this period as our presupposition. An obvious way to pry the Geniza documents open and make a dent in their silence is to read them together with Arabic texts concerning the Berber merchants, and in particular, Ibadi texts. In bringing these two bodies of text together, one is struck by the similar profile of Jewish and Ibadi leading merchants, men of standing in their respective communities, learned and pious. In a recent study of manuscript letters in private Ibadi libraries, Mohammed Neji called attention to the importance of these letters as a historical source, although, he says, they are largely ignored in Islamic studies. Ibadi manuscript collections, many of them in private libraries, do preserve such correspondence, apparently more so than is common in other manuscript collections. In Geniza studies, on the other hand, the importance of such letters has of course long been recognized. The evident next step is to cross information between these two bodies of texts. This leads us to ponder the unique character of the Cairo Geniza, which, unlike traditional Genizot, also functioned as an archive of secular material. As Goitain suggested, and I quote, "The Tunisians, whose base was in the Tunisian twin cities of Kairouan and Al-Mahdiya, were the initiators of the idea of the permanent Geniza, and in particular of the widening of its scope to comprise entirely secular material." Goitain continues, "Tunisia was at that time a great seat of Jewish learning, and it may well be that one of the leading scholars there instructed his flock to this effect." End of quote. But Goitain offers no explanation of why. Why in the world would a leading Tunisian Jewish scholar give such an instruction which has no basis in Jewish law? Assuming that the answer for this question must therefore be looked for in the non-Jewish environment, I had suggested a few years ago that the Tunisian Jews were inspired by the practices of Fatimid libraries. Some obvious differences with those Fatimid libraries, however, left this explanation wanting. There is no indication that the Geniza was perceived as part of an ideology of amassing knowledge, and the documents found in the Cairene Ben Ezra synagogue do not praise the beauty of the manuscripts discarded in it or their collector's value. Their preservation is a matter of fact which exudes practicality. Rather than trying to imitate the sumptuous Fatimid libraries, it stands to reason that Tunisian Jewish merchants simply followed what was considered to be best practice in the contemporary business community. As the Ibadi libraries show, this practice dictated the conservation of completed correspondence. Ibadi merchants kept such correspondence in the private family libraries, along with legal or religious manuscripts. The equivalent that suggested itself to Jewish Tunisian merchants in Cairo was the synagogue's Geniza, which was readily available. Now, I'm not suggesting that this practice created the Geniza, but it can explain some of its unique features. Now to theology. This is more complex. As Celia Francesca notes, trade during this period was not simply an economic story. Rather, it concerned also cultural exchange and the disposition of political power. Some of the Ibadi merchants traveling along the trade routes were also missionaries trained in theology. We have very few reports of theological discussions between merchants of different persuasions along the way, I should say along this way, because we have it from other places. Not only with potential converts, be they pagans or fellow Jewish merchants, but also with Muslim fellow travelers. One reason for this silence may have been that those conversations took place in Berber. We may assume that the product of such conversations is what we see in the gradual Islamization of the Sahel, although there is very little written evidence of the process. From its early beginnings, the Ibadiyya partook in theological discussions and included eminent theologians, mutakallimun, who strived to present their position with rational arguments. In scholarly discussions of the background for the development of North African Ibadism, one often compares them with the early Mu'tazila, but the evidence may suggest that Ibadi Kalam actually preceded the Mu'tazila. While both groups sent missionaries to North Africa at an early stage, the Ibadiyya proved politically more successful in creating stable, enduring political entities. Regarding North African Jews, the general assumption in scholarly literature is that in the early Middle Ages, when not following the Neoplatonic Fatimids, they were influenced, like their brethren in the Levant, by the Mu'tazila. The impact of Ibadi thought, however, must be taken into account and perhaps even considered as of primary importance. Ibadi Kalam is indeed quite close to the Mu'tazila, but they diverge on several essential topics: free will versus predestination, the state of the Muslim sinner, the created or uncreated nature of the Quran, and the specific Ibadi position on the imamate. These differences between the Ibadiyya and the Mu'tazila were marked quite early, and they are all specifically Muslim. Jewish theologians were not interested in the rules of the imamate or in the nature of the Quran. Furthermore, like the Mu'tazila, they were all staunch supporters of free will and were not troubled by the Quranic verses that suggest predestination, on which the Ibadis relied. It is therefore inherently difficult to find specific Ibadi fingerprints in Jewish theology. Nevertheless, we must, I think, recognize that the rationalistic traits in Jewish theology might have been overdetermined. They can reflect either Mu'tazilite thought as transmitted from the Jewish centers in the Levant, or Ibadi thought, or both. And yet, if we remain alert to the possibility of Jewish awareness of Ibadi theology, we may nevertheless detect its marks. Thus, a correspondence between the Jews of Kabes and Rav Hai ben Shri Gaon, who died in 1038, revolves around exegetical and theological questions. The exegetical questions refer to biblical verses, but Rav Hai, who can be seen as a follower of the Mu'tazila, points out that the theological problematic raised by the applicants, namely divine predestination, does not arise from the biblical text, but is rather that of the Kalam rational theology, and that the Arabic terminology is Quranic. Furthermore, even a question that seems to come solely from the Bible was in fact widely discussed by Muslims on the basis of the parallel Quran text. So, for instance, the question regarding the prophet Jonas. How could God choose for prophecy someone he knows will disobey him? A similar question is also discussed by the 8th century Ibadi scholar Abdurrahman al-Fazari, who is asked, how can the Quran say about the prophet Jonas that he was a transgressor, min al-zalimin? Rav Hai's answers reflects the consensus among Jewish theologians in the Levant. God's foreknowledge does not mean predestination. Humans are free to choose between good and evil and are rewarded accordingly. And the concept of predetermined span of life, ajal, is foreign to Judaism. By the same token, however, the questions addressed to him reflect, if not the consensus, then at least the concerns of the Jews of Kabes and those of their non-Jewish neighbors. The region as a whole, and Kabes itself, had gone through several periods of Kharijite rule, both Ibadi and Sufri. Although we do not know the exact date of the correspondence, in the first half of the 11th century, Ibadi presence in this area was still predominant. The Jews of Kabes were also involved in trading contacts with neighboring Kharijite centers. It is quite possible that the predestinarian reading of biblical verses contemplated by the Jews from Kabes was suggested to them following theological exchanges with Ibadi neighbors. A similar impact of local Ibadi concerns may be found in the questions concerning the relative degrees of prophets. Although similar discussions are to be found in the Orient among both Jews and Muslims, the concentration of a cluster of these specific questions in Kabes is nevertheless noteworthy. So I come to my conclusion. My suggestion that the tight trade connections with Berbers must have left significant marks on North African Jewish culture can, of course, be dismissed as mere speculation. The opposite suggestion, however, that these connections left no marks, seems to me to be even more speculative. Even a more moderate position, namely that the marks that these connections have left cannot be recovered, seems to me untenable. When Joseph van Es described his hunt for Ibadi manuscripts, he spoke as a detective who must speculate and use intuition in order to bridge over missing pieces. His recommendation was, when one works on the Ibadiyya, one must use some detective's flair. Another helpful advice is given by Peter Brown, who says, I quote, when faced with the history of the Maghrib, from Roman to Islamic times, a multidisciplinarity approach is a necessity. It does justice to the thrill of a silent land. It is their recommendation that I try to follow. In presenting this topic here, I hope to have drawn attention to what I see as an ignored, silent tell, the contours of which indicate the existence of hidden finds that call for deeper digging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a fascinating talk, which again raises many questions and which has given us much food for thought. I think we have room for 3 brief questions before we move to the next speaker. Anyone?
Thank you so much for the very impressive panel, very reliable. I want to ask, is there any footprints, let me call it like this, in the Geniza about the Draha communities? I mean, the eastern part of Morocco, because as you know, until the 30th century, it seems clear that maybe the majority of the inhabitants of Draha were Jews. Until today, we have a huge number of people who bear the name Drahi, Dre, there are a lot of them. So, is there any, what can you say about that?
Yes, thank you. For the earliest layers, what we have is what I called myths that may be true, but we cannot prove. But for Drav and for, in particular, we have evidence in the Geniza, in Geniza documents, also regarding the forced conversion of this community by the Almohads. Specifically, Sijil Masa is more known, but also Dra is mentioned by Abraham ibn Ezra and by others. So yes, and also later, after the Almohads, there are quite a few documents.